Okay. Namaste, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on Hindu decoloniality. This summer, I took the orientation to Hindu studies class with Kalyanji, who is the president of Hindu University of America. The class turned into actually a reorientation to Hindu studies for a lot of students. Hindu decoloniality has often spoken about needing educational institutions for Hindus by Hindus. We feel the gap when we see classes on yoga, Ayurveda, and the Shakti traditions being presented by Oxford, SOAS, or Harvard. People in this group have become quite astute at detecting colonial narratives in their promotional materials. Kalyanji and the faculty at HUA presented a vision of what Hindu studies should be when it was done from the Hindu paradigm. I thought I should invite him to this platform to talk more about that. We will spend 40 to 45 minutes in conversation, and then I'll open it to the audience for questions. Please leave your questions in the comments section, and I'll pick them up in the Q&A time at the end. Now, we're a little bit more informal here, Kalyanji, so I'll turn to you and I'll ask you if you can give a brief introduction of your work and your role at Hindu University of America, and what exactly do you mean by the Hindu paradigm?
Okay, great. I think it'd be very useful to just for me to share a little bit about my journey. I was also a child of the post-colonial world. I was born and raised in a family where there was a lot of confusion about Hinduism, even though there was a very strong commitment to certain rituals, certain practices, certain cultural forms, and so on. But in terms of intellectual grounding, it was quite weak. And there was a time in my life I also drifted away into the secular, narrative of progressivism and everything that we get caught up in today. And I had to find my way back to Hinduism by asking very searching questions. I was lucky to have encountered a terrific teacher. It's probably the great blessing of my life was that I got into contact with Swami Dayananda Saraswati, Puja Swami Dayananda Saraswati of Arshavidya Gurukulam. And I had a 21-year-long association with him. And clearly, that association brought into very sharp juxtaposition what Hinduism really was versus what it is being made out to be constantly in the media, in the academia, and so on and so forth. And the more I got into it, it became very clear there is a massive, massive dissonance. And so the seeds of the idea that there needs to be some corrective measure here, we need to reclaim the space of a proper study, learning, understanding of the Hindu traditions and culture and civilization from our own perspective, from our own paradigm, is so monumentally important if our future generations are not, caught up in all the mistranslations, the misinterpretations, the massive amount of distortions, and frankly, even you could say denunciations of Hinduism that goes on in the name of Hindu studies today. And so fast forward, here I am, I'm the president of Hindu University of America. And what we're trying to do is to create a curriculum that as authentically as possible recreates and represents the Hindu paradigm without the distortions introduced by various colonially derived overlays upon that understanding, right? So the question you're asking is, what is that Hindu paradigm? Well, that's something for us to discover. And it's a journey of discovery. It's not that, on one day you're going to get it and it's done. Because part of that journey is really deconditioning ourselves from the colonial, uh, superimpositions, the overlays that we are so inevitably stuck with, to the point that it's a real discipline to kind of constantly become aware of our own coloniality, and then to seek out what is Hinduism really saying, what it is really about, what is the Hindu paradigm. So I will leave it at that. Okay, that it is something to be discovered. I don't want to give you a clear answer like this is the Hindu paradigm, but there's lots of indications that we can provide, but it's something for each of us to really search, seek out, discover for ourselves. I hope that's satisfactory.
I actually want to dig into that just a little
Sure.
bit more. I want to probe that a
Sure.
little bit more,
Mhm.
if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
So can you give us an example of what is the Western paradigm? Like maybe an example in textual studies. What does that look like?
Yeah. So one of the stark differences between, say, a Western paradigm, and when I say Western, I mean a European, Eurocentric Western paradigm, and the Hindu paradigm. One of the fundamental ways in which they differ is that the nature of time. Okay. So the West really is committed to the view that time is flowing linearly. And in that linear flow of time, human beings are progressing. Okay. What that means is we used to be primitive. Now we are modern, we are advanced, we are progressed. And every generation is progressing beyond the previous generation. Okay. So now in this paradigm of progressivism, the wisdom of the ancients gets completely discounted, disqualified, rendered obsolete, archaic, antiquated, irrelevant, just because it is ancient. You see, and so it constitutes almost a barrier, a significant barrier in even exploring, investigating, inquiring into that wisdom of the ancients. And this is equally true for Greek thought or Hindu thought and so on and so forth. Whereas the Hindu paradigm, on the other hand, it appreciates, acknowledges, accepts the linear movement of time, but it also is fundamentally committed to that which is timeless and transcendental, if you will, right? That which is beyond time. So the way in Sanskrit it is phrased is Trikala Abaditam Satyam. Means truth is that which is not subject to the limitations of time. Trikala means the past, present, and future. So in the Hindu paradigm, there is a constant, incessant, deep striving towards the timeless and the transcendent. Okay. And the nature of the timeless and the transcendent is that it is relevant again and again and again in every new era, every new age, every new generation. And the new generation has to rediscover the timeless and the transcendental for itself. So it never goes obsolete. Okay. And this is so profound that until you get a grasp of it, that there is something very, very timeless and transcendental here that is intimately applicable to my life right now. Until you get a hold of it, it's very easy to fall prey to the sort of the lazy logic of progressivism and supersessionism, meaning everything in the old has been superseded so fundamentally that it is not even worth investigating or inquiring into. So that is one, say for example, distinction between the Western paradigm and the Hindu paradigm. And of course, the Hindu paradigm, the Hinduism itself captures that the timeless and the transcendent through the term Sanatana. Sanatana Dharma, that which is never old, that which can never become obsolete, that which is ever fresh, even though it's ancient.
How does that affect the way our history, for example, is read? Because we have a sense of, we use the term itihasa, but it doesn't really translate properly to history in the linear sense. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
So we have two terms, itihasa and purana. And of course, in the West, you have these two terms, history and mythology. Right? These two terms arise from incommensurable vocabularies. Incommensurable. What I mean by that is, if you lazily map history and mythology into itihasa, purana, etc., it will not work. Now, itihasa, as for example, right, in my understanding, itihasa contains a kernel of real events that happened in the past. But itihasa is a narration of those real events in poetic form, in exquisite poetic form, right? Which basically, you could say, it casts the events of the past into a timeless canvas. Okay. In other words, even though it is a story of certain specific characters, specific events that happened at a specific point of time in history, it is narrated as a timeless story. And that is the tendency of Hinduism, which is to keep remapping the time bound, the ephemeral, the transient, into the timeless again and again and again. So you asked the question, when did the Mahabharata happen? That's maybe a very exciting question for historians and people who want to argue endlessly about this particular date or that particular date and so on. But from a Hindu understanding, Mahabharata is happening right now in all our lives. It's happening all the time. It's never not happened. It's always happening. So that sense of the timeless being relevant immediately right now is the spirit of both itihasa and purana. Whereas the moment you render it into the language of history and mythology, you lose that completely. Why? Because in the Western paradigm, there is no notion of Sanatana.
Right.
Everything is getting obsoleted, rendered obsolete. Every minute we're in a new world, and so on. And so there is no anchor point in that which is timeless and eternal in the Western story about itself. And when the West tells the stories of the non-West, you know exactly what happens, right? I mean, it's a deadly outcome for the non-Western societies and cultures.
When I studied with my guru, what I found was we studied Mahabharata, and what I found is that it had meanings on several different levels. It had guidance for everyday samsara, but also there was always something going on beneath that. There's also always levels, which I felt when I read a translation which cast it as literature. All of those layers of meaning was kind of collapsed.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to try to take that a little further, right? The Hindu texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, the Itihasa, Purana, all of the literature, they throughout, regardless of what they are talking about, they carry within them a triple context, three layers of meaning and significance. And in the tradition, in the Hindu tradition, these three layers are understood a particular way. Okay, they are considered Adi Bhautika, Adi Daivika, and Adhyatmika. These are the three layers. Adi Bhautika means that which pertains to the visible, perceptible, sensory world or sensory domain, right? And you could equally render it as um, there's another word for it, which will come to me in a moment. But it's the physical. It is what we deal with in the Vyavaharika world, transactional world, so to speak, right? But there's another layer, the layer of Adi Daivika, which pertains to the mental, emotional, psychic, and Daiva. That is, so if Adi Bhautika can be rendered as the human body, the Sharira, and the universe, the Jagat Sharira, that pair, Adi Daivika can be rendered as Manas and Daiva, the mind, subtle, that which is not visible to anybody, right? It is not perceptible. You cannot measure it. So everything like, love, compassion, kindness, courage, all of these are invisible things. You cannot measure them. You cannot, there's a whole world which is very, very real, but it's not sensorily real, sensibly real in the sense of you cannot measure it, perceive it, etc. That's the Adidevika level. And then, of course, there is the third level, Adhyatmika, the ultimate reality. So, in terms of Satyam, right, you have these three kinds of truths. Vyavaharika Satyam, the truth at the level of empirical, perceptible, sensible reality. And then there is the Pratibhasika Satyam. And then this is the middle level, the Paramarthika Satyam, which is the ultimate reality. So these three layers of reality is constantly intertwined in the literature of Sanatana Dharma. And if you don't get that, right, you'll get stuck in a very, very mundane historical interpretation of the text, which renders it mediocre and literally meaningless in some sense.
Yeah.
So to give you an example, right, the Rig Veda begins with Agni Mele Purohitam. Agni. It's a hymn to Agni. Okay. So what is this Agni? In the everyday common understanding, Agni is translated as fire. Right? So, but the fire, the Agni as fire is only the Adi Bhautika, Vyavaharika interpretation of the word Agni. Okay. So Agni is fire. From the visible manifest fire, it is Agni. But it is also the fire of, fire in its most abstract sense, as energy, as transformation of the fire of the sun, the Sauragni, the fire of digestion,
Right.
the fires the energies that run this universe. That is Adidaivika Agni. Then, of course, there is the fire of enlightenment, of ultimate realization, of transcendental understanding. That is Paramarthika Agni. So, if we don't interpret Agni in that Agni Mile Purohitam verse as in these three levels, you get stuck with a very simple, simplistic kind of Western interpretation, which if you read Max Muller and others, you will find that why. So this is historical interpretation. Okay, why these Hindus were so concerned about Agni was because in those days there was no light, there was no electricity. Okay, so people needed to light a fire, and then the fire went out. It was very hard to light it up again. So for primitive humanity, Neanderthal humanity, maintaining the fires, burning constantly was very, very important. So it's a kind of a primitive expression of an ode to the fire, saying, oh, fire, if not for you, we would be, what would we be? We would have nothing. So it's turned into this type of interpretation, of primitivity, the assignment of primitivity.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it just renders the entire translation completely meaningless, which is what the Europeans did very successfully.
Yeah.
And,
here
and
we
they
are.
and they created a paradigm which even sustains today. And that's what you hear if you go to Harvard, if you go to Columbia, if you go to Berkeley, if you go to, regardless of where you go to Oxford, Cambridge, it is this same misinterpretation that is delivered as the study of Hinduism.
We observe that. We see, because we're on Facebook here, we see a lot of promotional material coming from Oxford Hindu Studies, for example, because they have a big online presence now. And the group has gotten really good at picking out like all the colonial narratives that are baked in into even just their promotional material, like the way they refer to Mahabharata as a literature, for example. Just a small example.
That's right. That literature is, see, the whole attitude behind that is, the Mahabharata as a piece of literature is going to teach us something about how those ancient primitive people lived, how they thought, what they were concerned about, what were what were the problems and challenges they were dealing with. So we're actually going to study about an ancient people through a text that was written long time ago. Not that the text has something of profound value for us right now.
Yeah. And here we are chanting Gita shlokas, every day. Some people, that's their practice. Yeah. Lighting, deepam every day for puja. Very, very living traditions for us, our ancient past for.
Correct. So we have to rescue the Sanatana, Sanatanatva, from that historical consciousness. That is essentially decoloniality in my mind. It is when you recapture that timeless essence, the relevance, the significance of Sanatana Dharma, and begin to understand it, then you have managed to kind of get rid of the fundamental colonial argument, which is that Hinduism is ancient, primitive, obsolete, irrelevant. But that's only the beginning. Now the next step is to go deep into it, understand it, make it your own, make it part of your own life, and really integrate it into our current life, our dharma, our swadharma today, consistent with our swabhava and so on. So, it's an incredible exploration. Once the blinders come off.
Yeah.
But boy, those blinders are hard to get rid of.
Well, there's too much noise. There's too much, there's just too many narratives, and people don't really know where to go, which is, it's good that now there's Hindu University of America to go. But one question I always had, maybe a lot of people in the group have, and you've actually addressed this in your class, was why is there such a gap in Hindu studies from the Hindu paradigm? India is a 1 billion strong Hindu population today, and they should have many institutions that do Hindu studies, decolonially do Hindu studies. Yeah. When I was researching, I found actually even the institutions that are offering Hindu studies, many of them are using German Indology, Indological textbooks. So why is there this gap? Not all, obviously. There's some very good ones like Chinmaya Vishwapritam, where they have their own curriculum, but they also label it as Indian knowledge system and not Hindu knowledge system.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I'm just wondering why there's such a gap.
Yeah. So basically, the problem was that even though the freedom struggle was inspired by Hindu ideas, Swami Vivekananda and Mahatma Gandhi and so on, when Jawaharlal Nehru became prime minister, the first prime minister of India, he brought into play essentially a set of European ideas, and he imagined a post-Hindu India. Very simply, bluntly put, a post-Hindu India. He bracketed Hinduism and said it belongs to the past, not to the future. And the future belongs to science and technology and, copying Europe and the West. And, everything was copied. The Constitution, the Indian Constitution is a cut and paste job, copying the British, French, and American constitutions. The institutions, the educational institutions of India are all replicas of the Western University, the German University. The first universities in India were set up by the British in 1857, right after the first war of independence, so to speak, right? Madras University, Calcutta University, Bombay University were all set up in 1857. And they simply replicated the patterns of learning that were prevalent in Oxford and Cambridge and so on. So fast forward, that the deeply colonized psyche of the Hindus amounted to really believing, internalizing the idea that the study of Hinduism is only going to take us back in time to a past that is no longer relevant, right? It is, to use the appropriate word, the study of Hinduism would be regressive, as opposed to us, wanting and desiring to be progressive. So the moment you create this dichotomy, if you're progressive, you can't study Hinduism, because that would be by definition regressive, right? So this resulted in there being absolutely no space afforded within the mainstream educational environment in India for Hindu studies. And wherever there was Hindu studies, it was placed in departments of history, anthropology, psychology, sociology, philosophy, all of which are Western disciplines, copied, right? And each one had its own angle of approach, and you could say even angle of attack against Hinduism, which got replicated, right? So the authentic study of Hinduism just simply got marginalized into the ashrams and gurukulams, right? So you had the Shankara mutts, you had the Ahobila mutts, and you had the Vaishnava mutts, you had the Chinmaya mission, you had the Arshavidya Gurukulam, the Belur mutt, so Aurobindo ashram, and on and on. So Hinduism got marginalized literally into the hills and the mountains and the forests, right? The Aranyakas, right? So mainstream universities had no curriculum at all, and we are dealing. You and I are dealing with the consequences of that phenomenon today. And in the meantime, the space was left unoccupied by Hindus. And just like, if you build a beautiful home, but you don't live there and leave it, abandon it for 50, 70 years, somebody starts occupying that space, right? So we've got all these Western scholars and academics and media people going on and on and on about Hinduism as though they know what they're talking about. And they have no idea. And we have no idea too, unfortunately, because we have not had the benefit of engaging, systematically, meticulously, intellectually, with the right community of people, so that those are our difficulties. And we are now dealing with the dissonance that exists, the cognitive dissonance that exists between the narratives we are receiving from the West and even from Indian institutions and universities and so on, and our own lived experience, which is completely at odds with this narrative, right?
Very much, yeah.
Yeah. And that's a challenge, and it's a huge challenge. And it's difficult to get over this challenge unless we submit ourselves to some sort of rigorous inquiry, examination, literally a new education about Hinduism.
And I think the forum here feels that most acutely when it comes to the caste issue.
Right.
What we see is that there's almost, within the Hindu circles, there's actually been quite a bit of scholarship around it, but the space is so crowded that somebody would have to recommend a book to you to really you couldn't like Google it and find it, or go into Google Scholar and find a scholarly article. So we get a lot of questions around caste and varna and jati. And a lot of it is, and that's where we feel the gap most, because we see that weaponized against us so much.
Right. Totally.
And so maybe you can talk a little bit about, the Hindu paradigm around this, the Varna Jati system. What was that, and how do we? The kind of the response is either there's never any issue with Varna Jati, or the other side is it's all bad. It's like forever has been bad for thousands of years. Brahminical supremacy and all that. So you talked about inquiry. So how do we? What is the Hindu paradigm about exploring this issue? You can answer that.
Okay, you're getting into a very, very, could say, sensitive and controversial topic, partly because our own community, the Hindu community, regardless of what jati we belong to or what varna we belong to, are totally confused about this situation. Okay. Now, I think there are two things involved. The decolonization requires two things. First thing is the recognition that the word caste, casta, systeme de castas, it is a vocabulary that originates in a Western experience, completely in a Western experience. Okay. And varna and jati originates from within a Hindu paradigm, Hindu experience. And varna, jati, kula, gotra, what is it, vamsa, and so on. There are a variety of terms that make perfect sense when situated inside a Hindu paradigm. And the Hindu paradigm it will not be complete until you also work with ideas like guna, karma, sattva, rajas, tamas. You work with purushartha, kama, artha, dharma, moksha. You deal with the three levels: adhibhautika, adhidaivika, adhyatmika, and you deal with ashrama dharma, that is brahmacharya, grihastha, and vanaprastha, and sannyasa, and so on. So there is a whole paradigm, whole structure within which varna and jati are intelligible. Okay, they make complete and total sense within that paradigm. But if you locate yourself in the caste paradigm, the caste as a term, systeme de castas, casta as a term, it comes from a completely different paradigm. And what is that paradigm? Which is very important. Okay, we often, people say, oh, castas is a Portuguese term or a Spanish term. But what was that term? Well, if you look into the history of that word, even briefly, what you'll find is castas emerged in the Spain and Portugal, even when they were under Islamic rule. Spain and Portugal, that is Iberia, as a part of Europe, was under Islamic rule for 800 years.
Right.
And Muslims used to have two kinds of slaves: the black slaves and the white slaves. So they had a term for the black slave. It's called abid. They had a term for the white slaves. It's called mamluk. They bought and sold white slaves as a matter of investment, commerce, money. They bought and sold black slaves for purposes of labor, back-breaking labor. And that was the origin of the word casta in the Spanish and Portuguese language. Now, fast forward, Spain gets reconquered by Reconquista, middle of the 15th century. Then what happened? The Ferdinand and Isabella came to power in Spain. and Portugal and Spain both got, precipitated into this age of discovery, so to speak, by the Catholic Church through its the two papal bulls. The later one was called Inter Cetera. The previous one was called something else. I forget now. I forget. So 1450s, 1490s, something like that. And then what happens? Promptly, Christopher Columbus lands up in Americas, and Vasco da Gama lands up in India. 1492, Christopher Columbus. 1498, Vasco da Gama in India. It's the same two countries, Spain and Portugal, in play. And two terms get transposed. The term Indian gets misapplied to the Americas.
Mm.
And the term Casta gets misapplied to India.
Mm.
Okay, so now everybody, the Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the American, the natives of America, the red people, everybody gets called Indians. Why? Because Columbus was looking for India, happened to be looking for India when he stumbled into the Americas. Now, similarly, the Casta got misapplied in India. Now, let's move forward. The conquest of the Americas, was a very violent affair.
Yeah.
Very violent affair. And there was extermination of wholesale extermination of peoples. And, there was a tremendous effort, especially in Latin America, Mexico, Latin America, in managing three groups of people, three castas. The white people, who were Europeans, who came from Spain and Portugal, the whites. Then the black people, who came from Africa as slaves. And then the middle, the reds, the browns, in the middle, who were called Indians. So you had three groups of people. These were the three primary castas, and it was totally a racial connotation. It was based on race, skin color, basically. So then once the three castas started living together in the Americas, you started getting all these other intermediate categories, castizo and mestizo, and there are like dozens and dozens of these terms that are applied to the offspring of mixed castas. A white and an Indian produces a certain caste. An Indian and a black produces another caste, and a black and so on and off. It goes along down the generations. So the word casta, therefore, is overloaded with a racial, uh, understanding. You go to India, the Hindu understanding of Varna and Jati, it's completely different. It has nothing to do with race at all. Right? Chatur Varnyam Maya System Guna Karma Vivagashah. Guna Karma means character, conduct, disposition, aspiration, value system. Karma means your action, your vocation, your occupation, the work that you do in your life. So Chaturvarnyam Maya System means, I'm quoting with the Bhagavad Gita, this combination of guna and karma, character and vocation, disposition and occupation, okay, aspiration and manifestation of that aspiration, right? That is what determines Varna. And throughout the Hindu texts, whether you're studying the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, or Puranas, or for that matter, the Smritis, the Veda, etc., this sense of guna and karma is completely consistently retained. And it has no connection with, birth, in the sense that one's Varna does not get predetermined totally by one's birth. This is the original Hindu understanding. If you extract it carefully from the Hindu texts, this is the understanding you will get. But then there is also this other factor called jatis. So what about the jatis? Well, the jatis are very mobile. They are upwardly mobile in the varna scale. They're also downwardly mobile in the varna scale. They go up and down across the generations, right? And how do they go up and down? Well, they manifest the character, the guna, and they do the kind of work, the karma, that takes them up and down the varna scale. And it is extremely fluid,
Yep.
right? And the last point about this is, when a society is upwardly mobile, meaning when the conditions of a society enable jatis to aspire to the higher varnas, right? There, it is only natural that the laboring class, the class of people who are laborers, service providers, aspire to become business people, entrepreneurs, vaishyas. And once you're a successful Vaishya, a business person, then you aspire for political power, Kshatriya. And when you're done, you're satiated with political power, then comes your aspiration for real knowledge and wisdom, Brahmana. Okay, so this is really a hierarchy of aspirations, not an attempt to maintain racial integrity of
Mm.
a plurality of races. So you see, what has happened is the transposition of the word casta, which originates from a primarily European experience, and overlaying it on the Hindu social order, has created such a havoc in terms of first and foremost European understanding of the Hindu social order, which has been exported back to India so thoroughgoingly that when Indians talk about caste, you think they think they know what they're talking about, but they don't. They have no idea what they're talking about. And this is true for Nehru, for Gandhi, for Vivekananda, and many others, because they had assimilated the vocabulary of caste. And once you do that, it's finished, okay? Because if you can't separate out the vocabulary of caste and what it contains in terms of the load of meaning, the overload of significance, historical significance, from the word varna and jati, which contains its own load of significance and meaning originating from within a Hindu paradigm, you can't separate it out. It's very confusing. And that is the confusion we are dealing with. And we don't have enough people on the Hindu side who are clear enough about it, who can articulate this issue and problem and challenge the Western understanding about this. We get entrapped easily into a Marxist way of dealing with it, wanting to uplift the downtrodden. Yeah, all of which has a place, but
Yeah.
it completely collapses two different paradigms.
Sure.
That's why I call them incommensurable paradigms. I mean, I don't know if that's adequate or not, but it's a much deeper subject. We should get into in more detail.
Yeah. And I think we are at the Q&A time. So we actually got a good question. And I'd love to have you back again here for another hour to dig into that. But if it's okay, I'm going to turn to the Q&A.
Sure, please.
But thank you. That made a lot of sense. Thank you. So one question I have from Sandhya is, I've taken a few HUA classes, very happy it exists. I would like to know Kalyanji's thoughts on the role of Bal Vihars in Hindu American space, writ education. Thousands of Hindu American children attend Bal Vihar every weekend. I attend Chinmaya Mission for 8 years. Are discussions on creating authentic Hindu consciousness happening? Bal Vihar seem to have a powerful anxiety about separating Hinduism from social movements and history in the subcontinent.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so there is a certain problem here, which is that, we want to be Hindus in America and dissociate ourselves from the subcontinent, the challenges of the subcontinent, okay? I think it's a hard problem to address, to solve. And I think that the at least the teachers of the Balvihar should go through a more substantive education and get a certification of some kind, which gives them an ability to navigate the uh, the issues and challenges that arise at the juncture of Hinduism in America and Hinduism in the subcontinent, in India, in Bharat. After all, the history is a shared history, regardless of where we live. And we live in a global era today. So I would say Bal Vihars are exceptionally important institutions. And the teachers could benefit greatly from a more standardized education spanning not only Hindu religious texts but also contemporary issues in society, contemporary challenges facing Hindus, um, and Western thought also, and what it brings to the table, which is constantly in our face and in an everyday sort of way.
And I actually felt that HUA does a really good job of not just presenting the Hindu perspective, but also talking about contemporary issues from the Hindu paradigm, as well as contrasting it with the Western paradigm.
Correct. So we want to, So we want Hindu studies to be in conversation with the contemporary discourses that are going on in the world, right? Ultimately we should have a perspective. What is the Hindu dharmic perspective about capitalism, communism, socialism, equality, hierarchy? There is a Hindu perspective here, which is very powerful, very profound. And if you can't get into that, right, what happens is you end up carrying a certain dissonance between these two worlds, the Western world with its own vocabulary, with its own ontology, its own epistemology, its own methodology of analysis, right? And then the Hindu world, which has got its own paradigm, its own ontology, epistemology, methodology, axiology, and so on. And if we can't participate in both these paradigms, carefully distinguishing the two, we never end up addressing the dissonance at the core that exists and continues to live for our young, not only for young people, even for older people. The dissonance never disappears in some sense, right? No. People keep on living with this problem. What does this mean? What does that mean? And it's a mass of confusion.
It's funny you would say that, because there was a time on the forum where we had a guy who was a capitalist and another person who was more on the left, let's put it that way. And then they were arguing whether Hinduism was progressive or free market oriented or whatever. And they went back and forth, and they were both presenting great arguments to fit Hinduism into their preferred economic models. But there was never the question, well, what does Hinduism actually ask?
Yeah. What does it have to say?
Yeah.
See, for example, one way of looking at it is the whole communist Marxist argument, the argument between the oppressor and the oppressed, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and so on, is really a conflict between Vaishyas and Shudras. That's it. In a manner of speaking, okay, that's strictly not the case, but still there's a correspondence there. Okay. Now, capitalism is completely available to Vaishyas and Shudras, for that matter. Shudras would become the laboring class, the proletariat, and the Vaishyas would become the bourgeoisie, the owning class, the entrepreneurs, the business people, and so on. But the profundity of Hindu thought is it exceeds that. Right? Today, if you take the four varna, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and look at American society is organized in terms of the Vaishya is at the top. The greatest caste in America is the Vaishya. The Kshatriya, the politician, the military, it serves the Vaishya, the business people. They're subordinate to the Vaishyas. And the professoriate, the Brahmanas, so to speak, right? They're strictly not Brahmanas, because Brahmana means Veda. Association with Veda is critical to Brahmana. But the professoriate, the intellectual class, they serve the Vaishyas and the Kshatriyas. And of course, you have the Shudras, the laboring class, the bottom layer, the bottom 50% of America, which has no wealth, no stability, no security. I mean, we know how unequal American society is today, right? So the point is, instead of, you can analyze Hinduism through the lens of capitalism and communism and socialism and so on and so forth. But what about analyzing American society, capitalism through the lens of Hinduism? That's just what I did, okay, in a couple of minutes. So that's a whole different understanding. And unless we have confidence and clarity about the Hindu paradigm, we will not be able to reverse the gaze and be able to understand Western frameworks of thought from within a Hindu lens, Hindu perspective. That would be very powerful, and we can do that.
So maybe we could talk about what programs HUA is offering for the community here a little bit
Sure.
at the end.
I mean, yeah. So I would say right now HUA has 4 divisions: a continuing education division, an undergraduate division, a graduate division, and an advanced studies division. 4 divisions, out of which 2 are currently active. The continuing education division is active, and the graduate division is active. In the graduate division, we have basically 3 major programs. One is called a Master of Arts in Hindu Studies, a Doctor of Hindu Studies, 2, and then a Master of Arts in Sanskrit. Only 3 programs. It's a graduate level. In the continuing education level, you have the basic continuing education program where people don't have to commit to a program of study. You can just take courses in an a la carte kind of manner. Just choose whatever you feel like selecting, choose. If you like it, continue, take a break, come back. That's the most casual way of learning. But for the more serious student, there are a variety of certificate programs. There is a certificate program in Hindu Studies, which I strongly recommend for anybody who wants to be a more active participant in the in protecting, preserving, safeguarding and transmitting Hindu Dharma for the future generations and so on. Anybody who's even halfway serious about it should get a certificate in Hindu Studies, minimally. That's not extremely academic. It's not going to ask you to write academic quality papers and all that, but conceptually it'll ground you in a way that, you'll come out completely transformed from that program. Then we have another program called the Certificate in Hindu Civilization Studies. That gets into a whole range of knowledge systems that were born out of Bharat, which have been rendered obsolete, but which have relevance and so on. So it's like a panoramic exploration of the Hindu civilization, per se. That's another different certificate. Then we have the certificate in a program in Sanskrit proficiency, which is like takes an entry-level person and delivers them with an adequate level of Sanskrit proficiency. There are different flavors. Certificate program in Bhagavad Gita through Sanskrit. So now you're learning the Bhagavad Gita, but also in Sanskrit. So you learn both the Gita and Sanskrit simultaneously. That's another certificate. And we have a few more. A certificate program in post-colonial Hindu studies. A certificate program in conflict and peace studies. We have another certificate called the Mahabharata certificate, which is an in-depth exploration of the Mahabharata, beginning to end. Really remarkable. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And in a sense, Mahabharata is the most important text for India, for Bharat, for Hindus, because first of all, it contains the Bhagavad Gita wholly within it, number one. And second is, it is a transitional text between the Vedic Hinduism and the Itihasa Puranic Hinduism. And the Itihasa Puranic Hinduism is what we today really practice in terms of our mandirs, Hindu temples, Hindu sampradayas, traditions, whether it is Vaishnava, whether it is Shaiva, whatever. All of it is, it sort of can be traced back to the Mahabharata as the central text. And it is a transitional text between the so-called Dwapara Yuga and the Kali Yuga. And that's why we feel, at Hindu University, we feel if there is one text Hindus should really master, it's the Mahabharata. Because it's a treatise on conflict, on peace, on violence, on non-violence, on ahimsa, and it's very relevant for our contemporary world. The Veda Upanishads become very esoteric. That is also important, and we will get into it in the master's programs, and the doctoral programs. But those are some of the programs that we have, and it's pretty much confined to basic core authentic Hindu studies at the moment.
Is there a question has come in? Is there one of these certificates you would recommend for parents to take?
It depends on what the parents want to do with that certificate. Okay. If the parents want to develop themselves as a kind of a teacher, an educator, an ambassador, a spokesperson, an activist, somebody who wants to play a role in clarifying, in communicating, in engaging in the world as a Hindu, with clarity and with confidence, right? Then I would certainly recommend the certificate program in Hindu Studies. And the entry-level course is the Orientation to Hindu Studies. So I would simply say, before you even consider any other program at HUA, the first course is you take the Orientation to Hindu Studies course. And then what that course will do is it'll sort of set the table for you. It'll sort of lay the table. And then you will find, people will find out for themselves how far they want to go, how deep they want to go, and in what direction they want to go. And what I have noticed is some people come out of the Orientation to Hindu Studies saying, look, for the next few years, I'm just going to study Sanskrit, which is fantastic, okay? And if you want to master Sanskrit, and I think as a Hindu, all of us should aspire to master Sanskrit in our lives, because otherwise you're stuck with Western English, European interpretation of the Sanskrit, and that's very, very constraining. So some people go to Sanskrit, some people go to the certificate program. Some people are very clear. They want to engage the academia on Hinduism. And that means you go into the master's program and the doctoral program. If you want to develop yourself as a leader, as a Hindu leader, a thought leader, a person who makes a real difference for the Hindu world in its intersections with the broader Western world, right? Then the doctoral program in Hindu studies would be most appropriate, because you really come out as a solid expert at that point. All doubts are resolved, and you have a grounding, and you develop your skills in writing and publishing and speaking and articulation and so on. So that creates a whole another level of preparation for this, for participating in the contemporary world. So all of these are possible. And I would say just get started with the Orientation to Hindu Studies course, and then find your way through the curriculum.
Yeah, and I should say that I'm enrolled in starting January in the doctoral program. So, one question has come in. I'm really interested in learning about yoga and Ayurveda in the Hindu paradigm. Is HUA offering classes in this field?
Yeah, so we do have, in fact, in the winter quarter, starting mid-January, we will offer a course on yoga called the holistic yoga, philosophy and practice. Okay, so that's a yoga course. It's an entry-level yoga course. On Ayurveda, we have a couple of courses called, uh, you know, mm, wellness, Ayurveda, wellness. I forget the name of the course, but there's an entry-level course in Ayurveda. But we have two other courses: disease through the lens of Ayurveda. How to look
Mm.
at our human conditions of the body through the lens of Ayurveda. That's the second course. And then we also have a course called diet, Ayurvedic diet, food, nutrition, and that whole, how uh, to make a lifestyle change for ourselves. So we have those three, but we are working on situating an Ayurveda health counselor certificate program, which would not only develop us in us the ability to deal with our own health through Ayurveda, but also to help a few others in our lives, our friends, family, and we can become a little bit of an expert, a counselor for others in how to use Ayurveda to mitigate our conditions instead of simply going to the emergency room when something goes haywire. You know, so yeah, they are developing. I think yoga and Ayurveda are developing areas. We have some preliminary material, but it will emerge in course of time.
So, just to end on a note here, um, we know that our educational institutions were destroyed, especially at the university level, nearly 1,000 years ago. So the HUA project is decolonization in action, right? We're taking back those institutions. And I just want to highlight that. So as a Hindu decoloniality group, how can we support the long-term success of this project?
Well, I mean, the first thing is you have to become a student at the university, and then you can offer opinions, perspectives, feedback. You can become an insider to the university, and see, at the end of the day, a university belongs to our community, to all of us. Okay, I am, to use a term from the Bhagavad Gita, I am merely an instrument in getting this started. And generations to come will have to nurture it, develop it, expand it, and make it real and make it strong. And so, therefore, I have no hesitation in saying, just get involved. Take a course, start experiencing the university, and then you'll become an insider to the university. And then you can offer your own uh, uh, counsel for how to develop it, advance it, and so on. So that would be my response to that.
Can the group support monetarily?
Oh, of course, absolutely. You go to hua.edu, hua.edu, and there's a give button at the top. You can click that and then you can support it. There's no problem. But more than giving, I would say become a student. Take a course. Understand what the university is trying to do. How a contemporary university like HUA, how can it serve the decolonization imperative? And how it can help us develop the skills and capacities that are required in our community broadly, so that we can engage in this project in a more systematic, rigorous, scholarly, and academic way.
Mm. Which is very needed because
Yeah,
our discourse tends to be at the level of Twitter, right? So,
yeah.
I think it's very needed in the community. Are there any closing comments you have, Kalyanji?
Well, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak to you and your audience. I really hope that we can build a closer relationship with the communities that are sort of inquiring in the same space and dealing with the same issues. Um, and I think, intellectual activity is best done in a scholarly and a university type of setting. So we can examine, we can argue, we can talk about it, look at it from different perspectives, really develop our ideas. then learn to articulate and speak about it in ways that make a real difference in the world. So I would invite people to get involved. And that'd be my message. But otherwise, decoloniality is a great project, no matter how we approach it. So I wish you all the very best in your journey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.